Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking time out of your day today to be here with us at Ascendle. I know you're all really busy. We appreciate that. We have a great turnout. My name is Diana Getman. I'm the president of Ascendle, and I'm going to be your moderator today. We're excited to share today's topic in our webinar series, Building Native Apps for Phone, Tablet, Watch, and TV with .NET, with presenters Dave Todaro and Craig Howard. Before we begin the presentation, I just want to remind you that we will be running a live Q&A toward the end of the webinar. We've enabled the Q&A feature located on the Zoom controls on your screen. So a reminder to submit questions there as opposed to the chat. And you can submit them at any time during the presentation. You can also click on the like button to upvote your favorite ones and make sure that we get to those. And if you miss anything in today's presentation, don't worry. We will send you a link to this webinar's recording along with the slide deck. So let me just take a moment to talk a little bit about Ascendle. For those of you who don't know us, Ascendle is a leader in custom software development. We partner with companies as their full service development team to create mobile and web applications to drive their business goals. We also offer product strategy, product design, and agile consulting services. Here are just a few of our clients. We work with a wide variety of clients from the early stage startup to some of the largest companies in the world. We are recognized experts in our field, and we are a Microsoft partner. And we love to share our many years of experience by teaching others. We have spoken to thousands of people around the world, presenting regularly with a variety of organizations at many different types of events. And our founder, Dave, is a recognized expert in our field. He spent 2 years to capture everything we know about Agile development and published the 500-page Epic Guide to Agile in 2019. So let me go ahead and introduce our presenters for today. Dave is the founder and CEO of Ascendle. Software is in his DNA. He thrives on using his more than 35 years of software development and Agile experience to help our clients achieve results that drive growth and profitability. Craig is a development lead with Ascendle. He is a strong talent due to his nearly 30 years of technical experience in a wide variety of fields, including aerospace and cybersecurity. Craig particularly enjoys the challenge of taking legacy applications and modernizing them with contemporary technologies. All right, I think it's time to move on to our feature presentation. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Di. And again, thank you everyone for taking time out of what I'm sure is a busy day today. So today we're going to be talking about mobile development. So we're usually talking about web development, building cloud applications, and we can design cloud applications or web applications in a way that it looks good on a phone and it looks good on an iPad or a tablet. But it doesn't quite match the native experience that we can get across a variety of mobile devices. And our challenge is that now we have an even bigger device landscape. We've got watches, we've got multi-screen devices, we have TV. So the challenge when it comes to development is, well, how do we do this? How do we deal with all of these different types of devices? Do we need to learn a different technology for each of them? And more important, do we need different people for each of them? Do we need different types of programmers? Do we need an iOS developer that knows the Apple side of things? Do we need someone that knows how to do watch versus TV? Do we need a .NET developer for targeting Windows devices and Java for targeting Android? So that's the big challenge. And many companies actually build their applications over and over and over again, one for each type of platform. And for certain specialized applications that might be necessary, but for the vast majority of the apps that we build, we really don't need to do that. And the good news is that there's a technology that allows us to address this challenge of targeting all of these different platforms. And that is what we're talking about today, a technology called Xamarin. Xamarin is something that is based on .NET. .NET is an open source technology that allows you to write code and target all kinds of devices. What Xamarin does is it allows us to write .NET code that is specifically tuned to the mobile device. and I'll talk in a moment about how we can actually share that .NET code across the different devices so that we don't need to write the same code over and over and over again to provide the experience for our users on each of the different platforms. So just a little bit of a background about Xamarin. You may or may not have heard of it before, but it's been around for a long time. It actually has its roots back in 2004 with a project called Mono. And Mono was this idea that we're going to take .NET, this very popular platform used by millions and millions of developers around the world, and let's figure out how to make that .NET framework more portable. And so Mono was born in 2004. Then the folks that got together to do that project said, well, wait a minute, we could probably make a company out of this because there are all these millions of developers that need to target mobile devices. And Xamarin was born in 2011. Microsoft kept close watch in terms of what those folks were doing. As we all know, Microsoft's foray into mobile with the Windows Phone didn't quite pan out. And what they realized is, okay, instead of trying to compete with iOS and Android, we should really embrace them. And they picked up Xamarin, they purchased the company in 2016 because they saw this opportunity for all of their .NET developers to now be able to target apps not only on the Windows platform, but across the various mobile platforms. So today, over 1.5 million developers are leveraging Xamarin for all kinds of different products all around the world. And looking forward a little bit, .NET MAUI, that's the multi-platform app user interface. What Microsoft is doing is really embracing Xamarin and continuing to move it forward. And what they're doing is they're pulling Xamarin into sort of the .NET proper and wrapping it into the core technology, which is .NET. So again, just a quick recap, .NET open source technology to allow us to build software across a multitude of devices. Xamarin, which is also open source. You can go on to GitHub and see the source code for Xamarin, is specialized and allows us to tune that code for a variety of apps, particularly mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets. And let's just take a little bit of a look at what Xamarin looks like under the covers. So what's really exciting about this technology, and we've been using this now for almost 8 years to build all of our mobile apps. This is the technology that we've used. We can write a lot of the code once and share it across the different platforms. So iOS, Android, Windows, for example, Windows 10. And with this, we can share roughly 75% of the code. So we can share 75% of the code, which is great, because now I just need to write a little bit of a code specific to each platform to address each of these. Now, Xamarin, what they said is, well, that's great, but I think we can do a little bit better. So they introduced what's called Xamarin Forms. Now, how this works is what we do is we look at the different types of UI patterns that we use across a bunch of different applications. If you use an app on your phone, particularly a business app, you're going to usually use a certain number of things. You might have a text box that lets you type in text. You might have a button. You might have a label. You might have an image or an animation or something like that that shows up. You might have some navigation, etc. What the Xamarin folks did is said, well, wait a minute. This is really the same across every platform. What if we created our own user interface framework and allowed developers to develop against that? So I want a text box here, another text box, a button, a button, a button. And then what we'll do is we will do the heavy lifting and do the hard work of making that native on each of the platforms. And that really is the secret sauce of Xamarin, because although we're writing .NET code and although we're using this forms technology to lay out the user interface, what Xamarin does under the covers is it takes all of that code and compiles it natively. So it is a real native mobile app. Just like you were to write that app from scratch on each of the platforms, but again, instead of writing it from scratch, I've got all this shared code. So now that I add Xamarin Forms into the mix, I can share a lot more code, up to about 90% of the code is what I can share at this stage of the game. If you wanted to cycle that, Craig. Yep, so about 90% of the shared code across the platforms. And I won't ruin the surprise here, but Craig will be talking about how we can do even one better than that. So what does this look like in practice? This is an actual app that we built for one of our clients, and it's iOS on the left and it's Android on the right. We wrote one set of code and compiled it natively for each platform. And as you can see, the user experience is identical. So what we didn't have to worry about is, oh, I run it on Apple and it kind of looks like this. Now I need to tweak it special for Android because it doesn't quite look right. We created it once and compiled it, and it just works. And as you notice up at the top, it's a little bit subtle, but the navigation where it says invitation details, there's a slight difference right there because that's the platform specific navigation. iOS on the left with the centered invitation details and the little arrow pointing to the left, whereas on Android it has the icon with the left of aligned invitation details. But the rest of it is identical. These are real screenshots just added to this mockup for theatrical effect here. And so that's the big takeaway. We get the biggest bang for the buck because we can write and test the code and then compile it, and then we get the real app in terms of all these different platforms. So that's sort of the high level why around Xamarin. That's why we use this technology to build our mobile apps, and it's why we can deliver so much value for our clients. And you know, I don't work for Microsoft, I don't work for Xamarin. I'm just really excited about this particular framework because it gives you so much power in terms of your development team. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Craig. Craig is going to talk a little bit about how this works under the covers, what you can do with this. And my hope today is that you can kind of look at this and maybe start thinking about what are the exciting things that I might be able to do with our applications. And as Craig will talk about at the end, it's not limited to phones and tablets. Xamarin can also be used to target the desktop for both Mac and Windows. Same set of code, and you can also target watch and TV with the same core set of code. So with that, I will hand the microphone over to Craig.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, so as Dave mentioned, Xamarin Forms is all about sharing UI. So what you see here is a bunch of common screens that you typically see on mobile devices, like a tabbed page where you're scrolling through the different tabs by swiping, or a carousel page if you have graphics that you want to flip through. The cool thing about this is you pick one, you write the code once, and it's going to work on both Android and iOS and other devices that you're targeting, which is really nice. Within the page layouts, you have content layouts. These go inside, for example, an about page. You may use you know, the content view or a grid view if you have images. So all these common choices that you typically have. And then as Dave mentioned, there's a bunch of controls, like a button, a box view, an image, a label. And also Dave mentioned that all of these things are compiled natively. So a button that you're used to seeing on the iOS is going to look the same as other iOS applications. And on Android, it might look slightly different, but it looks the same as on Android applications. So as Dave mentioned, we can share up to 90% of the code because all of our business logic is shared. And if you're using Xamarin Forms, all the UI is shared. But what's not shared is some of the platform specific code. So for example, if you wanted to send an SMS message, you would write some code as shown in the pink box for your iPhone, and then a little bit different code to send an SMS message on the Android. And then if you're targeting some Windows you know, devices or desktop, you know, yet another flavor there. So what's really cool is these things are similar across different devices. And Xamarin and Microsoft noticed this, and they said, well, what if we built yet another way to share code called Xamarin Essentials? Now, Xamarin Essentials is really cool because some of those common features like checking battery life or checking if you have network connectivity, sending an SMS message, Those things are all built into Xamarin Essentials. And so now you can share even more code, and you can, with Forms, you can get up to 90%. And then with Essentials, you can get up to 98% of shared code, which is really great. You don't really have to touch the pink and the green and the light blue boxes anymore, because you're sharing a lot of your code. Here are the things that Xamarin Essentials supports today, like the compass. You could detect if you're shaking your device. You can access maps and geocoding. It's really cool. Network connectivity is super helpful when you're designing mobile applications. And the nice thing about these things too is, for example, if you were to send an SMS message, it's actually only a few lines of code, and you don't have to figure out how does this work on all the different platforms that I'm targeting. So when you're developing with Xamarin, like we mentioned, you only have to use one language. You can use your team that already knows .NET, and they can work on all the different devices together. We talked about sharing 98% of the code. And today, you have access to all the .NET standard features. And I know .NET gets a little confusing because there's .NET Framework, there's .NET Standard, there's .NET Core. But Microsoft is working on solving that problem. They're going to make it into just one .NET platform. And as Dave mentioned, Xamarin is actually going to become part of the .NET platform. It's not just going to be a separate add-on, which is kind of cool. Automated testing. We love unit testing. We have high standards for code coverage at Ascendle, and it's very cool that the unit testing for all the shared code is all the same tests. So you don't have to write separate tests for all the different platforms. Visual Studio is a great editor. There's Visual Studio Mac as well. There's all kinds of great features in there to help boost your productivity, like IntelliSense. They support all the different device emulators, so you don't need to have an Android and an iPhone and a watch and everything at your disposal. You can actually use the emulators right from Visual Studio, which is really cool. And then, as Dave mentioned, it's all compiled natively for each device. So you're not going to get a slow performing application because you chose to use Xamarin. Yeah, we haven't really talked about watches yet, but Xamarin also supports Watch OS and Android Wear. Watches do all kinds of cool things today. They can connect to Wi-Fi. Some of them have GPS built in. They can play videos. So you can really make some cool apps. And I'd mentioned some of the device features like network connectivity and battery life. Xamarin Essentials works when you're targeting the watch as well. And tvOS and Tizen. tvOS is Apple TV, and Tizen was created by Samsung, so it's kind of specific to some of their TVs. But those two TV platforms are supported. You can actually use Xamarin Forms if you're targeting a TV application. So again, what I just really love about Xamarin is that it's in C#, which is my favorite language. You have full access to all the .NET features that have been developed over the years, and you can share the code, and your team can all work on the same thing. So yeah, key takeaways for this is, Xamarin's cross-platform. You don't have to write different pieces of code for the different things you're targeting. Xamarin's continually adding more and more features. The earlier features of Xamarin Forms were a little buggy, but now it's been under development for a long time, and it's getting really solid. And I had mentioned before, use your existing .NET skills, your teams, and code. And as more devices come out, like the Microsoft Surface Duo that Dave had showed on a previous slide with 2 screens, those things will automatically be supported by Xamarin. So, yeah, that was kind of a quick run through of Xamarin and how you can target all these different devices with .NET. And hopefully you got something out of this and it gave you excitement to build mobile apps as opposed to where am I going to find all these different people to support all these different devices. And I will hand it back to Di now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Craig and Dave, for a really informative presentation. We do have some questions from the audience, and I will go ahead and read them. And Dave or Craig, you could decide who will answer them. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and put your answer in the Q&A window. I've heard from an attendee that they can't see the questions, so I will go ahead and read them out loud. But go ahead and put your question in there, and we will try to get to all of them. So the first one is, I already have an iOS app that is working. Does it make sense to use Xamarin for the Android version that does not exist yet?
Yeah, I could answer that. So yeah, that's a common thing. Sometimes people have a developer that knows iOS, and the popularity of iPhones is really high. So it's common for you to start with one device and see how it works and then move on to another device. I would say, yeah, for Android, start using Xamarin, because my guess is you're going to want those devices to act the same. And yes, you're starting from scratch and you're starting over, but at the point where you develop your application and it becomes equivalent in functionality to the iOS application, you could now get rid of that code base because your application written in Xamarin is going to work on both. And then from that point forward, you can continue to use Xamarin and target other devices.
And to add to that, one thing to remember, I forget the exact statistic, but it's something like more than 50% of the cost of developing any application is after you ship version 1.0. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because unless your application just kind of falls flat, you might spend 6 to 12 months building version 1, but then you might spend another 3 to 5 or even 10 years continuing to build on that application. So the initial effort is really small in the overall scheme of things. So continuing to maintain those multiple code bases gets expensive because, remember, you may not be targeting just the Android phone. You might also be targeting Watch and the Apple Watch and TV, etc. Perhaps even desktop apps. So I think that you're right, Craig. I think that since you are really starting from scratch, if you have written a pure native iOS app, then it would make sense to adopt something like Xamarin because that's going to give you more options. And then what you could do is you could actually, once you build out that functionality and kind of get it on par with the iOS app, you can then compile the iOS version from Xamarin, and now you are on that same code base. So it could be actually sort of an agile approach, right? Incremental and iterative, where you can get onto one code base, because again, if you have two completely different sets of code and you're going to continue to maintain that app, you're going to continue to rack up costs at 2x the rate because you're developing the same code twice.
Great. Okay, I have another question here. Does all the shared code need to be on .NET Standard, or can you use the framework as well?
Yeah, I could take a stab at that. So .NET Standard is actually a specification. And so what you would need to do is select the correct .NET framework or .NET Core that supports .NET Standard. Like I said, it's a little confusing, but .NET Standard is basically the specification of all the features of .NET that are available. So for example, if the framework version supports .NET Standard, that means it has all of those features in the standard. Hopefully that answers your question, Eric.
Great. We have a question from Bob. Back in 2014, I had a development team that was tasked with supporting mobile apps in iOS and Android. We committed a lot of effort to adopt Xamarin, but ultimately it crashed and burned because the team was heavily disposed to iOS and felt they had to make too many compromises in their design versus the iOS design patterns they were accustomed to. Is that no longer a likely issue?
Yeah, I can take on that one. Yeah, it's a good question, Bob, and certainly you guys were sort of on the earlier side of Xamarin. It has come a long way in terms of allowing you to target those different platforms. If you did have a super complex design on iOS and you had then attempted to move it to Android, it really depends on how it was built. You know, Xamarin supports what are called custom renderers, which allows you to write code that targets each specific platform. I think with the advent of Xamarin Forms, and I'm not sure if you were using Xamarin Forms at that time or if you were using sort of the more pure approach where you're building the UI twice. If you were building the UI twice, I think that, yeah, you probably had some diminishing returns using Xamarin. Xamarin today is a lot different animal, and by using Xamarin Forms, you can, I think, get a much bigger leverage. And does it require some design constraints? I don't think it requires design constraints. Again, if you wanted to build, say, a game, Xamarin Forms probably isn't the right sort of platform, because as its name would imply, it's really designed around forms, more for business applications. You can write games using Xamarin and by using that custom renderer type of technique, which is going to essentially draw the user interface, especially for each type of platform. But for business applications, I'm still a big believer in Xamarin. We were using Xamarin starting way back in 2012, so I definitely feel your pain. When we did our newer applications, things got dramatically more smooth. We did use some frameworks back then. For example, MVVM Cross is a popular one that allowed us to do some things on that would kind of make things work a little bit better on the platforms. So I think that, you know, when you say that they're making too many compromises in their design, my guess is that it was perhaps not as good a fit for Xamarin Forms. So I think the key takeaway for me would be, I would look at the needs of the application, and I would look at what's supported by Xamarin Forms, and I would say to myself, can I heavily leverage Xamarin Forms for the UI? And if the answer is yes, I'm going to get a bigger ROI on my investment, because I'm going to get more stuff, quote unquote, for free, because Xamarin is doing the heavy lifting in the UI. If I said, well, I can't really use much Xamarin Forms, I think what I would then do is look at Xamarin Essentials, because that's the other huge part of mobile development, is targeting those native kind of more hardware coupled features, whether it's the flashlight or the GPS or it's the camera. It's kind of a pain to manage those on a platform by platform basis. I would then say, well, can I heavily leverage Xamarin Essentials? Am I going to have such a tie-in to the underlying hardware that I'm going to be able to heavily leverage this? And even if I couldn't leverage Xamarin Forms, I think I still would think twice before throwing in the towel on Xamarin, because you're going to get a big ROI. If you look at both Xamarin Forms and Xamarin Essentials, and you're not targeting something like the watch or the TV, you know, it might make sense to look at a different type of platform, because I think those are the big ROI. So for example, React Native is one of the big competitors of Xamarin, which allows you to write JavaScript code much like you would on a website. You might even be able to reuse code that you've built for your web application. And if it is heavily customized, you know, maybe you're going to get a little bit of an uplift with React Native. But if you've got .NET folks, you know, the big, as I'm talking out loud here, the other big factor, the other huge X factor for us was the ability for us to do real automated testing of the platform and the user interface logic, all in .NET, all using automated unit test tools that the team was already used to, and leveraging our existing architectural patterns that we had developed over years for .NET in terms of you know, the separation of concerns and the other architectural things that we do. So it's not just about the UI, it's also about the underlying piece of that. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall back when you guys were tackling that to see if I could help out. And I have an open offer. My contact information is on the screen. If you guys are working with Xamarin right now and have questions, reach out. Be more than happy to share, you know, all of the arrows in our back that we've learned over the years.
Thanks, Dave. I have another question here. Can Xamarin be used with native iOS or Android libraries?
Yes, actually, the screen that we showed that had the pink and the green and the blue boxes, you have full access still to the native iOS and Android libraries. So if there is something that you run into that isn't supported by Xamarin Essentials or Xamarin Forms, you do still have full access to those libraries, and you can continue to write your code in C#, which is pretty cool.
Great. Okay, the next one here. Does Xamarin support embedded devices, for example, Raspberry Pi?
That would be a no, but you could write like web services in any language that the Raspberry Pi supports, and you could communicate to them through a Xamarin, application. But I think your question is can you deploy to a Raspberry Pi? And the answer for that is no.
Yeah, there is one sneaky workaround to that, which is you could actually run Android on your Raspberry Pi. So if you ran Android on your Raspberry Pi, then you could actually target Android when you're compiling your Xamarin code. So you could kind of do an end run around it in that case.
Yeah, there are a lot of people out there they're trying to push the edge of Xamarin and what it can do. And yeah, that certainly could be an example of someone saying, oh, you sure can use it. Just run Android. Good answer, Dave.
Absolutely.
All right, this next question might be good for Dave from Price. Would Ascendle help a company with this implementation? If yes, what would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, that could range anything from reach out to me. I'm more than happy to lend a helping hand in terms of providing any sort of insight based on the background and our experience. No charge, happy to help. All the way from one of our development teams taking on your project and working with you to design and build and code and test and support that application. So it really runs the gamut from that one extreme to the other. The middle of the road is working with you on strategy, essentially figuring out how would we build this, what's the right approach, how can we ensure that we're going to lay the groundwork correctly with Xamarin so that we can in fact leverage the huge wins that you can get. And that includes the various software engineering disciplines that are really going to give you good results. So for example, if your team isn't doing any sort of unit testing right now, we could help ensure that when you put that framework together with Xamarin, that you are implementing the appropriate unit tests so that you can really leverage the platform and get a really high quality product. My world before unit testing was largely spent fixing bugs after the product was shipped for 6 to 12 months after each new release. That was a real nightmare. Those of us who have started using automation, particularly with unit testing, it's a whole new world. We now ship our products and we might have 1 to 3 bugs in 3 months that we discover that kind of made it through the gauntlet of our testing. So absolutely would be happy to help in any form that's appropriate.
Great. I have another one here. What are the advantages of Xamarin over hybrid apps?
I can take that one. Xamarin does have a couple of advantages. One of them is the development environment. And I know I'm a little biased because I'm a Microsoft developer, but most people recognize that the Microsoft tooling is really the best in the world as far as the developer experience. The other thing that's a huge advantage is that if you do have .NET and C# developers already, the learning curve is just removed as far as the language goes. Certainly, you'll be learning about the mobile world and devices and the hardware and whatnot, but the fact that you can just remove the learning curve from the programming language and the framework, and you can just be in a familiar environment, not only from the coding and the language, but from the tooling as well, is just huge. And then the ability to use the same architecture. So one of the projects that we did with our client, the architecture and the structure of the mobile app and the companion web application behind the scenes was virtually identical. There were a few different technology changes depending on which platform you were on, but familiarity makes you money because anytime your developers don't have to learn something brand spanking new, you're going to be able to let them spend more of their time focused on producing business value, which is going to save you money. So that's a couple of them, a combination of the language, the tooling, the patterns, the practices, etc. The other thing is that from a performance standpoint, Xamarin has an edge over hybrid apps because they're not actually rendering the application using essentially the embedded web browser. So a hybrid application, if you're not familiar, is essentially taking a web application and wrapping it and sticking it on the phone and putting it in the App Store. And essentially what's happening is that the framework is showing a little web browser and rendering HTML and executing JavaScript. And it's just not going to be quite as fast because you're kind of pulling a fast one in order to get that app on the phone. You're not actually jacking into the native framework libraries that are residing on that phone and the native processing power of the phone. And lastly, the user interface, if it's important for your application to look like the other apps on that phone, and today there are many apps that don't look like your traditional applications. Games, for example, every time you open a game, you couldn't tell that that's on an Android device versus an iOS device. But that is one other benefit. You're going to use the native user interface libraries on each of those platforms, which ties not only into performance, but it also ties into the look and feel. So those are just some of the few advantages.
Excellent. All right, I have a couple more here. If Xamarin is incorporated into .NET 6, what impact will that have on existing apps written in Xamarin, i.e. will upgrades be required?
I can take a stab at that. So yeah, .NET 6, when it comes out, will have Xamarin. As Dave mentioned in the timeline, Xamarin is actually going to become .NET MAUI, multi-application UI. So from what I've read, Microsoft is going to keep those Xamarin namespaces the same, and developers of Xamarin or Xamarin developers should just look at this as the next version of Xamarin. So much like there may be some changes for you to do when you're going from Xamarin Forms 4 to 5, there might be some small changes to do when you start using .NET 6 and .NET MAUI. So it's to be seen. It's not going to come out yet until next year, but Microsoft always does a good job at posting migration guides to help you with your existing apps. But they know that there are a lot of applications out there, so they certainly don't want to strand everybody by folding it into .NET.
Great. Okay, I have one more here. How are automated unit tests written and run? Are they only written once and run for both platforms?
I can take that one. So the short answer is they are written just like any other unit tests you would write in .NET. So you would have typically a unit test project that has all your unit tests, which is targeting your other project. And without going into an excruciating amount of technical detail, essentially how Xamarin applications are built is typically using a model view model pattern, or MVVM. What that means is that everything that has to do with the business logic, as well as persisting data and calculations, as well as the logic of the user interface, is all written in common code and shared code, and you can write unit tests against all of that. The example I use is if you think about it, sort of an old school calculator with the rubber buttons. If you peeled the rubber buttons off, that's the user interface. The actual little plastic chiclet buttons that are underneath the rubber piece that you just pulled off, that would be the view model, or the model of the view. What we can do is we can unit test from that layer down all the way into the database. So again, thinking about the calculator, I could simulate the user clicking those buttons, all automated, all via unit tests, and all executed all day, every day, and making sure that everything is working. And that's a pretty big deal. That's actually kind of harder to do, honestly, in a web application than it is in a Xamarin app, because it lets me test things such as, okay, well, if the user does this, this little green flag should show up. I can write code that says, okay, let me simulate clicking this button, and let me simulate looking at that green flag showing up, and even verifying that it's the color green. That can all be unit tested. And then the only thing that's on the rubber keys, so to speak, is the rest of the dots and colors. Where are the text boxes? Where are the buttons? What's the alignment? What's the font size? Things like that are typically not unit tested. But the good news is that usually someone isn't going to give back your software or give back your app if there's a button misaligned by 2 pixels, or it's the slightly wrong color based on your branding guidelines. What they will do is if the thing crashes, or the calculations are wrong, or it doesn't work half the time, or the navigation is all screwed up, they're going to stop using your app. So the really good news about unit testing in Xamarin is that you can test the stuff that matters. And then the only thing that's left to typically test manually, although there are ways to automate even from the user interface itself, typically that's low risk and easy to detect. When you're using the application, someone's going to notice, hey, how did that button get screwed up? It's totally misaligned. Let's fix that. So as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about the unit testing aspect of Xamarin. And I would say that the ability to do that with that MVVM architecture might be on par with, if not kind of trumps, the ability for us to share the user interface across platforms. It's just that powerful.
Great. All right. That is all for our questions from the audience. And it looks like we have reached the end of our time together. Thank you all again for attending today's webinar. Thank you, Dave and Craig, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. It's much appreciated. If you want to learn more about this and other topics, please go to our website at ascendle.com and sign up to receive our blog posts. And that will also sign you up to receive updates about upcoming webinars.